You're listening to the Meditation and Attachment Podcast with George Haas. For more information, please visit our website at www.mettagroup.org. That's www.mettagroup.org.
So welcome everybody. This is Meditation and Attachment, Deepening Your Practice. It is 7:35 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. It is October 28th, 2021. And what I thought we would talk about tonight is practice and organizing practice and householderism and what that's like. And what then might be a long goal for practice or one of the things that's true about doing attachment work and the organization of the instructions that we do here are that people who come to us tend to come to us as a I hate to say last resort, but an alternative resort to other things that they've tried in the past in order to deal with their attachment conditioning, or their suffering might be just a better way to put it. Most of the time in the West, because meditation is not as widely spread as it is in countries where Buddhism is the dominant religious experience, is that people come out of the mainstream presentations without having found what they wanted and continue to seek out this alternatives to that for the most part. Well, mindfulness or the mindfulness movement is getting much more wide acceptance. It is still not the kind of deep practice that would lead to liberation. And I don't think it's actually marketed as something that would do that. And so people that are drawn to that are looking for stress reduction or an increase in happiness or something that supports the kind of life that they've had, and that people that come more toward the deep end of practice are coming either because of the suffering nature of their life, or because having pursued and succeeded in a lot of the things that we offer in our culture as meaningful and satisfying, don't find that meaning or level of satisfaction that they wanted. I often describe it as a bell curve. At one end of the bell curve are people that don't function well enough to get into the game. And so really the motivation there is to fix the problems so they can get into the game of pursuing things in our culture. And at the other end of the spectrum are people who have succeeded very well in getting the goals that are offered in our culture, and still find that it's not meaningful in a way that eliminates the despair that can be associated with a life that isn't, say, connected, or a life that doesn't support exploration that's meaningful. I think that in some sense, teachers teach what they know or teach what they've had the experience of, and I have a tendency to prefer teachers who present themselves authentically and talk about their own experiences and their own motivations and finding their way into this path, this path of liberation. I tell this story quite a bit because it really sort of encapsulates this. But when I was a kid in high school, the White album came out by the Beatles. I don't know if you have heard it, if you're not old enough to have been around when it came out. And it was quite fantastic, psychedelic, and at the same time spiritual and sort of as avant-garde as mainstream pop music can get, and the Beatles went to India and sat with the Maharishi and wrote most of the songs that appeared on the albums while they were there meditating. And so meditation was this thing that a lot of us tried. So you can imagine a 15-year-old version of me meditating back in the OH days, I like to say, the original hippie days. They're back, by the way, if you happen to look outside at any moment. The hippie days are back, which I'm quite pleased with. But it didn't really sink in at that point beyond just that sort of cultural surface experience. And I got into the pursuit of ordinary things, ordinary pursuits. You know, you come out of high school, if you're affluent, a direction toward college. If at that time, of course, you could work a minimum wage job and afford an apartment. It's very different now than what it was. It wasn't really until I got into New York and during the AIDS period in New York in the 80s when it was the experience of being involved in the culture of the gay community and just this terrible task of caring for people who were dying, and different than it is now in a way. If you got AIDS, it was pretty much 100% that you were going to die horribly in a few months, which is very different than COVID. And also, there was a complete hostility from the government toward people who were sick, which is also very different than what it is now with COVID. And so banding together to try and manage that ourselves. But the stress of that was so intense that I needed something beyond what I had been able to put together just in a social life. And so I went into meditation with this really a real need to be able to come to terms with the daily experience that I was having, so that I could operate well enough to meet the things that I needed to do or wanted to do. And coming out of that kind of conditioning and the kind of crap childhood I had, I came with a lot of difficulties in trust. We talk about around here epistemic trust, which is the foundation for the capacity to learn. You need to be able to believe that the person that is teaching you is telling you the truth. And you need to believe that the reason that they're telling you what they're telling you is because their intention is to be helpful to you. And if you don't have those things in place, it's very difficult to take in any information that they're offering you. And one of the things about being a gay person, and particularly for my generation, is that when I was growing up and coming of age and interested in exploring that, it was illegal and punishable by prison in all 50 states to be caught engaged in that. If you came out, most of the time you were kicked out of your family and cut off. And most of the time you lost your whole social network. And so the coming out process is quite different than it is in some environments. Here, I would guess there's plenty of places that those conditions are still apply. So one of the difficulties I had in pursuing meditation and exploring what that might mean is that I needed to be able to form relationships with people and form epistemic trust with them so that they could teach me. And I had a really challenging time doing that. And I've always been pretty clever at this. So I would set up these elaborate tests that they would have to get through. And most of the time they didn't. Of course, I wasn't telling them that it was an elaborate test they needed to get through. I just set up the circumstances and they would fail. And then I would say, aha, they're not trustworthy. And I would move on. Christian?
Were the tests always, I would never test you, George. Were the tests always unfair, or were they actually helpful for you?
Depends on your point of view, I would guess. I always thought they were perfectly straightforward. No. Mainly it had to do with the kindness and the level of kindness. So I would be late. And then I would track how they responded to that. If they were very kind and understanding about it, then they passed the test. And if they demanded that I actually keep my agreements, maybe not. I'm trying to think of an occasion. I was assisting in the leading of a day-long retreat, and it was kind of in the Zen school of things, and even though it was a Theravada class, and I was the one who was supposed to ring the bell in the transition between sitting meditation and walking meditation, and then ring the bell again in transition from walking meditation to sitting meditation, which was all silent. And we walked around the zendo, and you were supposed to ring the bell at the top of the zendo so that everybody would have time to adjust to sit. And I didn't. I had a moment of mindlessness and didn't ring the bell until I was on the last side of the zendo. And when we sat down, the meditation teacher said in front of everyone, obviously you shouldn't be ringing the bell, which was enough for me to leave the community permanently. So to give you an idea of that, I think maybe some other people might have weathered that, but it was too unkind for me. Is that making sense? Maybe fragile is a word that I could apply to myself in those experiences. I was very fragile. And there's a lot of books that are written about meditation, and you can take in content from them and sometimes be able to practice it in a way that provides the insights that you need. But I found most of the time that what I really needed was somebody to walk me through it. And that requires this connection to somebody else, this capacity for relationship. One of the other things about my early experience was that I was angry, quite angry. Anger was the primary means of emotional regulation that I used. The experience of being growing up in the way that I did, the experience of my time in New York, brittle and angry might be a good way to describe it. But it's very painful to be in those kinds of states. And what I wanted to do was to be able to come out of that. And I engaged in the usual things. Getting sober, for instance, was one thing. And then engaging in psychotherapy in addition to the at that time in the 70s. There wasn't a lot of options for treating addiction in the way that they are now. Essentially, it was AA. And there was AA and Al-Anon, and that was pretty much it. There's been a proliferation of programs since then. I think, what is it, 158 12-step based programs or something like that. So when I bombed out of the community that when I moved to Los Angeles, I first associated with, I had a long stretch as I like to call it a Dharma orphan. So a student with no teacher. And I bought a catalog called Buddhism in America, which was actually just a collection of advertisements for every meditation center in the country. And I read it page to page, and I centered in on a couple of ads for different groups. And one of the ads, and I wanted it to be local, and so there was really only one choice in Los Angeles, which was the Vipassana Support Institute, which was Shinzen Young's organization, and he had a center in West LA, which also doubled as a house that he lived in, and so I did what I normally did at the time, which was I went to a lot of events that he offered when he wasn't there, so that I could quiz his students to see what kind of person he really was, and whether he was really kind or whether there was some kind of nefarious activity happening. And VSI's, Vipassana Support Institute, it's now Vipassana Support International, when they relocated to Canada. And I started sitting, and Shinzen's approach was very sort of technical. One of the things that I began to understand about myself and the way that I learn is I need lots and lots of instructions. There's no level of too much instruction really for the way my mind works. And Shinzen was very good at parsing things out in smaller and smaller levels. And you could ask him about it and he would explain it and go deep. And he was unfailingly kind. He's the first meditation teacher I ever encountered that passed all of my traps, including the really elaborate ones, and so that was wonderful for me, being so paranoid. And at the same time, he was not enmeshing, so that there wasn't that sense of intrusion that sometimes happens when the boundaries aren't good. And the community around him, I had run into issues with other communities where everybody was much older than I was, and so this group had people that were my age, which was also a nice thing, and also creative people, which was a nice thing. The other thing about Shinzen that I really liked is that he was enlightenment oriented, and he believed that you could practice in a way that in this lifetime you could have, as he would say, at least stream entry, and then go for the long goal. When I first moved to Los Angeles in 1992, and the first introduction to Vipassana class I went to, the teacher had everybody say what they wanted to get out of the class, and I, in a sort of peachy, naive way of being, said, "I want to be enlightened," and there was a kind of cruel laughter that followed that, and so it was very clear that that in that group, in that culture, that enlightenment for householders or even for practitioners was not possible, and that was disappointing. Stas?
I don't want to interrupt. I'm on the edge of my seat. Well, you probably will talk about this. My sense, you're coming up on the enlightenment piece. My sense is most people are interested in just stress reduction and happiness. And I think once you get on the often bumpy ride to enlightenment, a lot of people want to get off unless you're pursuing it as an exploration, and you have a lot of support to do it.
Right. Well, that big bump in the middle of the bell curve, they're not interested. Life is working well enough for them that they don't want the disruption that often comes from that. So I get that is also my experience. And I think that the group that functions very well, that comes because having gotten everything that they were supposed to get, that was supposed to make for a fulfilling life, didn't end up working for them. And even though they're good at getting goals, they're not good at exploring things that actually provide that sense of meaning to them. So I practiced diligently, and I began to. I found Shinzen trustworthy enough that I was willing to try the things that he recommended and pursued that, and I had good results in terms of experiences, and my suffering went down quite dramatically. So that became the push toward that. But like a lot of things, I noticed for instance, when I was in the 12-step world, I applied myself to that and got good results. But then the results, the progress beyond that beginning place, the places I need to go didn't happen, and so I went into a psychotherapy thing, and then when that actually didn't produce the results I needed, I went into the meditation world. Stas?
So one thing I've always wondered is, it seems like you've always known how to explore. It just, in the beginning, you would abandon the exploration when it would get too intense.
If I reflect on that in terms of a attachment strategy, so when you look at attachment, secure people tend to explore pretty well. They tend to understand what's meaningful to them, and they tend to put resources into that. I was complexly disorganized. Complexly disorganized people know what has meaning to them, and they know how to pursue that when they're emotionally regulated, but they're not good at emotionally regulating. And so what you have in that constellation are these fits and starts, where you're regulated, you're in a good place, and you begin to pursue the thing that you want. But because you aren't able to sustain that for long enough, you don't get much beyond the beginning. The other part about growing up in the way that I did was that I had to keep the things that were really meaningful to me secret. And then that fits really well into the dismissing mind state. You know it's meaningful to you, and you can pursue it if there's space to do that, but you don't share it with anyone, and it's very private. So that would be the primary exploration. The secondary exploration, of course, is where you're going for things that have high social value, high remunerative value, or power, so that you can have resources to transact things. And so you're nearly always diverted into those kinds of activities. Disorganized people don't function very well, so it's very minimal, the capacity of life. I mean, it's really much more hand to mouth, scraping by, just getting the minimum necessary. when you don't function very well and you have a hard time really just getting the minimum, there isn't a lot of time, energy, or resources left for the exploration. So you have to get yourself into a good place, and then you can begin. But because it's impossible to sustain that, those early promising beginnings collapse. Sometimes there's a middle, or a little part of the middle, but almost no finishes, which over the course of a life begins to accumulate disappointment. And that at a certain point, you simply don't want to try anymore, because the failure will bring disappointment that will resonate with the disappointment that you've already accumulated. And so you begin to avoid the exploration, to avoid the disappointment that comes from failing again. Different people, different attachment strategies explore differently, but dismissing people tend to be mainly focused on getting resources to transact their needs. Those preoccupied people abandon their exploration altogether for proximity and emotional regulation from their attachment figures. Is that making sense? So I tell this story quite a bit because I think it illustrates this conundrum. When I first got sober in 1978, after my 90 days, my sponsor at the time said, "So you're going to wear the cloak of AA loosely around you as you cross the bridge and go back out into life." And I couldn't imagine what I would do then. And he said, "Well, you just go and figure out what you like and go do more of that." And I said, "Well, how do you do that?" And he said, "Well, what kind of apples do you like?" I tell this story enough that if you may have heard it. Said, "Well, I don't really like apples. They're hard and sour." And he said, "Well, Granny Smiths are hard and sour. There's lots of apples out there. What other kinds do you like?" And I said, "Those are the only kinds we ever had." So he said, "You're going to go to the Korean deli, you're going to buy a Granny Smith and one other apple, you're going to eat them both. And then the next day you're going to go back and you're going to buy the apple that you liked better and another apple. You're going to do that every day until you've gone through all of the apples that are for sale at the Korean deli," which if you were in New York in the 70s would realize it was like 25 varieties of apples that they sold in Korean delis. And so I did that, and at the end of it, Gala apples was the one that I liked. But that's the metaphor of exploration. But that was actually exploration. But once you begin to understand that the thing about exploration is that most exploration doesn't lead anywhere. And people who understand this about exploration have a resiliency because they know most of it isn't going to turn out. And so they go and explore and see what it is. And if they like something about it, then they pursue that more. And it tends to direct you in this path of meaning that you don't need to know when you start out. You just need to be able to take the next step in the exploration and then be open and allow it to lead you into these places of deeper meaning. And if you develop the skill of doing it and you're just constantly doing that, life is taking you in these directions that were unknowable to you and yet rich with a sense of meaning. But you have to get yourself in a place where you have the time, energy, and resources to be able to do that. And what often happens when you have some inhibition around exploration is that you build your life in such a way that it doesn't allow for the really meaningful exploration as a way of defending against having to discover that. The problem, of course, is if you don't explore in a way that's primarily meaningful, then it leads to a kind of despair about life and the difficulty of life. which is only exacerbated with aging. I mean, this is going to be just a whole surprise for you. um,
I love surprises.
that is a very good attitude to have around this. So when you begin the practice then, and you're in earnest in trying to understand what it is that the deep insight practice is meant to reveal, is really exploring the nature of your conditioning and how that conditioning causes you to create conceptual reality in a certain way, and pulling apart the nature of conceptual reality so that you can see what's actually happening in each moment. One of the things about my own practice is that early on, Shinzen wanted his I guess I would call it intermediate students to start teaching, because there's a process in relaying the meditation experiences to other people that causes you to have to think about them in a way that brings a clarity to them. That if you didn't have to think about them in a way that was descriptive and communicative, you might not understand it as clearly for yourself. So it became a means to help newcomers that were coming and people were interested in, and also to be able to further your own understanding of where your practice was or is. And so I began to do that, and that's actually what brought me to teaching the attachment stuff that I do, because one of the things to understand is you put yourself out there into the world, and the people that see that presentation and resonate with it are drawn to you, and they're drawn to you for something. And I initially started teaching Shinzen stuff and didn't get much traction with it. And I can understand that. Why would you come to me to learn Shinzen stuff when you could go to Shinzen and learn it directly from him? Although I did discover early on that people said to me that the way I described it was easier for them to understand than the way Shinzen described it, which was a real insight to the nature. You express yourself, and people resonate with it, and somebody else's expresses the same thing, but in the way that they express it. If you don't resonate, if you're not able to enmesh with that, I was talking about that earlier today. Your conditioning entangles with other people's conditioning if there's space for that to happen, and if there isn't space for that to happen, you don't entangle. The example that I often use is, if you speak English and you encounter somebody who only speaks Japanese, it's much harder to entangle in an intimate way with them, because there's no conditioning that matches well enough that you can express yourself in a subtle and nuanced way. Somebody came up to me and said, George, you used to be the angriest person I've ever met, and you're not angry anymore. And that actually is what interests me about how you teach. What I want to know is, how can I become less angry? And so I taught a class on overcoming anger. And then somebody came up and said, anger isn't my issue. Fear is my issue. Can you teach a class on fear? So I taught a class on fear. And then somebody came up and said, anger and fear are not my issues. Sadness is my issue. Colleen?
You say that anger is a secondary emotion. So when you taught your class on anger, were you like trying to explore what the primary emotion was, or?
Anger is an emotional regulation strategy, and then what's underneath the anger that you can then come into awarenesses. The strategies that I teach, the investigating self-generated emotion, or stopping afflictive self-generated emotion, quantumizing the pool and poison and pain, came out of trying to address very dissociative structures to the way that I operated in the world. And it was really a part of parsing apart that process of dissociation, and also understanding the experience of the present moment and the experience of being lost in thought. And so all of those were really what that early piece was, just the using mindfulness or vipassana meditation to track your thinking processes, understanding how that relates to emotion, and then changing it so that you're not having to use anger. We don't, when I was reading about this initially years ago, I guess it's probably 20 years ago or now. So now, what I came across over and over again was that people have a small set of skills to emotionally regulate themselves. They mostly learn them in childhood, and they don't really ever update them. They said that because the process of learning to emotionally regulate happens in these in intimate relationships of parent-child, say, or somebody who's close to you, that unless you're in a relationship that you're quite intimate with, you don't have a close enough awareness of how the other person is emotionally regulating that you can then learn the steps that you need to in order to take on that tool. So that what it said was that if people are in long-standing intimate relationships, sometimes they can take on an emotional regulation strategy from their partner. They can learn it that way, but most of the time we operate with that original grouping that we got from our family systems. Now, if you looked at my family system, the strategies were not good. I mean, it was, anger, sadness, fear were the main strategies that we had. It was a hard drinking Irish family, and alcohol was probably the biggest regulator that most of the adults in the family used. At some point in my recovery, I made the alcoholic family tree, and pretty much every branch was a light. Is that answering your question?
Yes, thank you.
So somebody came up to me and said, anger and fear aren't my issue. Sadness is my issue. So I taught a class on sadness. I was teaching these 3 classes called Overcoming Anger, Overcoming Fear, Overcoming Sadness. And then somebody came up to me and said, anger, fear, and sadness aren't my issues. Shame is my issues. Could you teach a class on shame? And this light bulb went off in my head is, I'm just going to teach one big class called Overcoming Difficult Emotions. And I started to teach that class, and people came up to me and said, it's actually not the difficult emotions that are a problem. It's the relationships that cause them, which is what opened up the understanding that, this is about relationships, this is about attachment. People are people who can form relationships that are supportive, that don't consume everything, have these lives that are more regulated, more even, and that they then have the energy and the space to explore things that have meaning. And so that way of being is more useful, particularly if you want to practice deeply, because you need to create time, energy, and resources that are available for you to pursue the practice. When I looked around for people to help with attachment repair, so this would be in the mid-90s, there just wasn't anything around for that. And so I just began to adapt my own meditation practice and focus on that. And I did find a lot of relief in that, which actually created this space for practice, which I think was really useful. So part of this is, and relating it to the topic of the evening is, what is it you want to get out of your practice, and how are you going to organize your life in such a way that you have time, energy, and resources available so that you can pursue the practice? And then if you can't do that right now, what's in the way of doing that, and what do you need to do to clear out those obstacles so that you can then begin to pursue it? What I notice about people who have done that is that it is possible to go quite deep into practice and to have insights into the nature of this human conditioning that open up into this place of sacredness, I would call it, and it's coming mainly from practicing with Dan and the way that he talks about it. Before that, I would have described it as engagement, to be fully present and capable of engaging the experience of the present moment without getting sidetracked or derailed by conditioning. But then as I engage in these other practices, and that is one thing to understand, that you engage in a particular practice and it tends to produce a particular insight. There's a quality of sacredness that arises, which is quite appealing. So there's a question from Stas. I didn't find alcohol or drugs regulating. Does that mean I never learned how? Yes, that's what that means. That it's probably not used in your family system in a way that you learned. And you know what? I would really recommend that you don't learn it. So then, why don't we do some practice? Any preference for a metta practice or a vipassana practice?
I'd love to do some metta practice.
Metta?
Yeah.
Everybody's good with metta? I do think that it is useful to intentionally develop positivity, and that actually in the metta vipassana formulation of teaching, that's actually the first thing that you do. You get a base level of concentration, and then you intentionally develop a sense of positivity that you can use as a refuge, so that if you go into the vipassana side of practice and encounter things that are distressing or difficult, you can withdraw from them and come into the refuge of the positive states that loving kindness tends to produce. So let's do it for an easy person, and then we can practice a little bit for self. So any comments or questions on the practice that we just did? Stas?
If anybody wants to go first, I can hold the question. All right.
Go ahead.
Goes. So in your one of the manuals I'm reading, the instructions say focus on the sensations of the mind state. And since I've known you, you've always said that there's no sensations to metamind.
Which manual are you reading?
Addiction.
Oh, I'm pretty sure I'm referring to the PT aspect.
But that would only come after you, yeah.
Right. I think that the sensitivity to people not being able to concentrate very well, so the PT doesn't arise, and then sort of struggling to understand what a mindset is, has led me to be more forthright about there being no sensations associated with it. But so it's just a development of the languaging of how to teach it, because the manual was written 5 years ago.
Yeah, it's very hard to explain something, focus on something that has no sensations.
Well, the view is very clear once you pick it up.
Yeah.
And you can tell whether it's there or not. But if you don't, if you haven't yet discovered that there are views and that that you have them all the time, and that they distort everything, it's a thing. The Sayadaw would say that views have no sensations, and that he would recommend that you alternate doing walking practice with eyes open with sitting practice, so that you could see the way that conceptual reality was formed and how views affected it. But without that option, it's hard to instruct that. Mostly, and particularly now that everything's virtual, it's just we're all sitting looking at our screens. Making sense? Someone else?
Yeah. Thank you. That was great. I think I sat with you for like 3.5 years, like every morning, and haven't in many years. And I don't know if it's the memories or whatever, the practice came back quite quickly. And when I was sitting with you then, with lots of concentration, I realized that metta came from this part of my brain.
Right.
Is it wrong to, in practice, like to go here or whatever, instead of, because that's where I knew it was, or whatever, instead of like directing my attention towards this space, because I know that's where I've experienced it from?
I think it's a good idea to come up out of the body, and that's the same area where the PT arises when I'm concentrated on the state, but making sure that you're holding the view, and then as the concentration develops, the PT arises, and then switching to holding the sensation rather than the view.
Okay.
Good enough?
Yeah.
Someone
I
else?
was kind of, I'm a little tired. I didn't sleep well, so I was like kind of in and out, but yeah. So sometimes it was just tough to focus on the hearing the words and stuff. So.
Right. Yeah, everything goes in the background except for the view, and then holding the view. And then as it energizes, you notice the PT arising. Most people actually experience it up here, the PT. And then we just make that the object. It's easier to hold because it has a quality to it that isn't just the view. And you notice in Vipassana jhana practice or high concentration states with insight as the object of meditation, or you go into piti. So you practice, you attempt to concentrate on an anchor, let's say the breath, and then once you notice piti arising anywhere in the body, you switch to that. And the piti is the thing that carries you into the high concentration state. It's the same in the metta practice, except the piti arises in response to the metta object rather than to the insight object or the concentration anchor.
I will say that when I was on retreat with you and I actually experienced the metta jhana the first time, it was one of the most profound experiences of my life. So yeah.
The Sayadaw calls them bliss bombs.
I did walk out of that experience into that field towards that big tree, which may or may not have burned.
Oh,
And a huge great horned owl flew over my head.
nice.
Like, what is happening here? Yeah, that's great.
At La Casa de Maria, where the retreat was, there's a 120-year-old eucalyptus tree, which is massive. I mean,
yeah.
It's not so much that it burned, but it all was washed away in a mudslide.
Oh.
It's the building where we sat, the meditation is gone. The cafeteria where we ate is gone. The lounge is gone. There's some remnants of the chapel left, but the mud was sort of 6 feet high up in the chapel. And then it washed down and knocked out some of the dormitories.
In Pismo, that one?
Yeah, up in Montecito, that one.
Okay.
So, and they didn't have flood insurance, so it wasn't covered by insurance, the damage.
Oh, that's terrible.
So they've been fundraising for probably almost 8 years or so to try and rebuild it. So the retreat is sold out, but we do have a waiting list for it in case you didn't sign up for it and you were thinking about it. We have the third day of the 3-day level 1 series is not this Saturday, but the following Saturday. We're going to start a level 2 class on January 11th. If you're interested in doing that with mentoring sessions, there's only a couple of places left for that. I'm not sure, one or two left. And then we will be doing a meditation and addiction retreat in January. We always do the addiction retreats as a 2-day thing, all day Saturday, half a day Sunday. So that's coming up. And then we're going to do another level 1 in this winter. So that's what's coming up. All of that stuff is on the website. Because we have had so many requests to do the level 1 retreats on Sunday instead of on Saturday, we're going to do 2 level 1s at the same time, one every other week on Saturday and one every other week on Sunday, so that you'll be able to get that. So that's what's coming up. Take a look on that. I offer this class on a dana basis. So dana is the Pali word for generosity. So I offer the teaching freely, but I do hope you'll make a donation. There's a link to do so on the website. Any amount is useful. And of course, if you're not resourced, please come and sit with us. We're happy to support the space for that. Thank you for coming, and I will see you soon, I hope. Bye.
Thanks, George.